Thanks all for coming. I love talking about genocide and other issues on such a lovely day, so I'm glad you guys are too. Cool, so I was hoping to just have a short slide just to show some of the lessons learned on student activism that I've been involved with as well as others. In most social justice initiatives generally have come from young people. It's crazy how young both King and Gandhi and others have been. And it's cool to see how many more young people are getting involved, and technology has made that even easier, cheaper, faster, wider. So it's cool to see what lessons have been applied and what lessons still should be learned. So as you heard, just give a quick background about myself. Grandchild of 4 Holocaust survivors. My mother was an orphan when the Nazis took over Austria, was able to get refuge in Scotland on a kinder transport. And so my mom was born and raised in Glasgow. Came to Ecuador to get warmer weather when she was 19, and my dad's parents were in the concentration camps, and at the end were able to get refuge in Ecuador. So my parents met, got married, and I was raised in Ecuador for 18 years. So I always heard the lessons of never again, never again. And I was fortunate to get a scholarship to come to the United States and go to Swarthmore. And in 2004, the President of the United States and Congress, first time ever in history, declared an ongoing crisis, a genocide. We've always avoided using the G word because it usually requires some type of action. And so finally, in the present crisis with Darfur, they called it a genocide. And so the question is, sort of, did the lessons of never again and never forget, would they be applied? We were successfully able to deploy American armed forces and those of our allies. Citizens got really involved in helping stop the Holocaust. And the question is, would we be able to do the same thing on Darfur? And so given that background, I was in the cafeteria with one of my friends, and there's an article by Nick Kristof about Darfur. And so the question for me wasn't, should I do something or should I not? It was, what can I do? What can I do as an average American to help stop the genocide happening thousands of miles away? And so fortunately, I love the Mark Twain quote, "Don't let school interfere with your education." So I skipped class and went to the library and came across this amazing book by our former US Ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power. If you haven't read this book, I strongly encourage you to read it. It's phenomenal. And she looks at all the genocides of the past century, looks at what people did, what people didn't do, and she looks at what needs to be done to prevent and stop genocide. And her analysis was really good. It was looking at a classic excuses, we didn't know about it. And she shows methodically that was never the case. We've always had the information about the Holocaust or Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, today Darfur, South Sudan, the Rohingya in Burma, Syria, Yemen. There's all these crises that we've always known, and especially now that we have more TV and more internet, that excuse does not hold. The other excuse was we don't have the capacity to do anything about it. And that also has never been true. We've always had a very powerful military, we've had a powerful diplomatic corps, we've always had the ability to do something about it. So the question is why? Why do we keep saying never again every single time? And the answer she shows, and we agree, is that there isn't enough political pressure. Americans strangely get political on lots of other issues. Could be gun control, could be climate change, could be pro-choice, pro-life. But when it comes to things like genocide and mass atrocities, as well as other things, Americans tend to take out their checkbooks or get on PayPal and give money to humanitarian aid, but we don't pick up the phone or go to a town hall meeting and demand action from our policymakers. And until we shift from treating genocide and mass atrocities as a humanitarian crisis and treat it as a security crisis, which requires political pressure, or political players to do something, we'll keep saying never again every time. So we took these lessons to heart, and my classmates and I at Swarthmore created an organization called the Genocide Intervention Network. And what we did was we looked at all the past initiatives on trying to prevent and stop past genocides and mass atrocities and trying to learn from those lessons. And we were lucky to reach out to Samantha Power and get her, we recruited her onto our board so we could continue to look at her analysis and apply, adapt and adopt to the current times in Darfur. And so we came up with this language that a lot of people are now calling social entrepreneurship. It's sort of like what has been done before, what are the gaps missing, how can we do some things that are different? There are amazing organizations out there that do phenomenal work on human rights. Famous ones like Amnesty International with letters to prisoners of conscience. Human Rights Watch does phenomenal work at reporting and researching and exposing the crisis. But we really were seeing that there was a missing gap in the political pressure piece. So we're trying to look at innovative ways, not just in the space of human rights and mass atrocities, but also, or looking at, in that space, but looking at what are some innovative tools that are being used in other areas that we can apply to that space. So one of the big lessons that we were looking at is people tend to create these silos of the three sectors of society. So that's the private sector, the public sector, and civil society. And a lot with social entrepreneurship is sort of breaking through those three silos. Is there's opportunities to engage all of those. You don't have to just create a nonprofit or a company or get involved in government. Oftentimes there are partnerships where you can create in all of them. So the big one for civil societies, as we'll see and we've seen in the past, is universities tend to be a hotbed of creating pressure, and obviously faith communities historically have been another hotbed, and so sustaining within those communities and looking at others. And the other big thing is not homogenizing much amongst each sector. In the private sector, everyone thinks about corporations, but there's also more and more financial services, which are also corporations, but really looking at the role of money. Supply chains have been used a lot in the case of like the Congo or in other places, and really looking at the media. We talk about fake news a lot now, but it is crazy how little people pressure media companies to do more. We tend to complain about them, we tend to not engage them and lobby them and say, this is newsworthy, you should cover more of this, I would like to see more coverage on these issues. And then in the public sector, people tend to just focus at the federal government. There's a lot of amazing work you could do at the city, state, county level, as well as looking at judicial branch, looking at legislative and executive as well. And if you look at the, let's say, the gay marriage issue, is that they did phenomenal success looking at the judicial branch at each state and getting enough pressure that they could do it at the federal level instead of just focusing their attention in one level. So this is one of the primary lessons that we've learned is don't just keep focusing on the White House and yelling. There's other places where you can engage. The other big lesson is, and students, especially at Swarthmore, are really good at getting adversarial. Anyone who's in a position of power is seen as evil, corrupt, not helpful, and that is just not the case. The famous example I use at Swarthmore, which is a pretty liberal school, is that it made me more conservative because how little students were willing to think about collaborating with people in power. And the example I use is the animal rights group on campus was very upset that they were serving meal in our cafeteria. There's only one cafeteria at Swarthmore, and so they were planning a protest outside of the cafeteria. They were putting up posters in the cafeteria, and one of the cafeteria administrators saw the poster and was talking to the student putting it up, and the student expressed why veal was bad and all the reasons. And the administrator said, all right, we'll stop serving it. And they didn't have to plan the whole rally and protest. They could have just met with the people of power. And I think this is a lesson if we think about the Women's March not that many months ago, is thinking about, in addition to the traditional techniques of protest, is you can stand outside of Congress, but there's also the ability to go inside the halls of Congress and meet with your legislators and talk to them and talk to their staff. Because many, many times they are in agreements or they're uninformed, and you can help inform them, or you can help persuade them to change their behavior instead of just yelling at them from outside. The biggest thing that we did was coming up with this approach based on these past tools, is looking at how to educate, advocate, donate, and by doing that all through creating a political constituency. So our goal, and fortunately Facebook had just come out at the time, in early 2004, was to create a chapter in every congressional district where people would raise awareness about what's happening in Darfur, get people to pressure their policymakers at every level, and then look at the role of companies. A lot of endowments hold a lot of stocks in a lot of these companies. With shareholder activism, we could see the change in corporate behavior, and as well as to donate to the immediate relief of what was happening in Darfur. So this was our strategic approach to trying to create change. Oftentimes, when we look at past ways of student protest or general activism, is a lot of times people were told that they had to do something, or they were guilted into it. And so the approach that we often took was, how can you engage people through the 3 E's? And that's make it easy, effective, and entertaining. So we constantly kept to ask ourselves, how could we get someone to do something to help on Darfur or other things? And that is, you got to do it in 5 minutes or less. There's lots of things about turning up or coming to an event on such a beautiful day. Few people are going to do that, but they may be willing to make a phone call. They may be willing to send an email, a tweet, a Facebook post, a donation. There's all these other things you can do, and it's incumbent on the activist who's willing to spend more than 5 minutes to come up with 5-minute actions that people can get involved with. The other one is effective, and that is, no one wants to waste their time. So if they are going to give you 5 minutes or 10 or 15 or 5 hours, you got to make sure you're maximizing the impact for that action. So oftentimes people sadly don't necessarily know how policy is made. I learned, despite having a degree in political science, more from Schoolhouse Rock and similar types of resources about how a bill becomes a law. And so when a bill passes the House and then it goes to the Senate, in many examples, there's no point in calling your House member. And yet with healthcare, I still know people who are calling their House member and not their senator. There's lots of ways. Sometimes the bills come through both, or sometimes they get passed in the Senate and the House, so it's not always a clear sign. But if it's on you to get people to be involved, and there's a bill that's in a certain committee or subcommittee, or it's in the Congress and not yet on the White House, you need to make sure that if you're going to get someone to take action, it's got to have a maximum ROI. And we didn't see that level of sophistication, or don't see enough of it, that we wish people would get involved with. And the last one is, you can do good and have fun at the same time. It sounds weird having fun stopping genocide, but there are ways you can do it. People came up with creative ways all across the country. There were high schoolers in Denver who did Dance Dance Revolution, sort of like an arcade game. And their principal said, if you can raise $1,000, I will participate in Dance Revolution. So they did Dance for Darfur. There was a woman who on eBay would sew in the UN emblem on underwear. She called it Panties for Protection. I couldn't come up with stuff like that. And was able to raise money to do something about Darfur. 10 high schoolers in Kansas ran from Oklahoma, ran from Tulsa to Washington, D.C. That's what they were good at. They were runners. And so they were able to raise over $20,000 for this campaign. So people can take what they like doing, what they want to do, what's fun, and still do good. It doesn't always have to be because you're forced or guilted into it. And so what we did was we tried to combine all these ideas. And as students, the accountability tool that was used on us was our report card. And lots of other organizations and issues use report cards to grade members of Congress. No one was doing that yet on Darfur. We don't see enough of it on human rights at large. So we created Darfur scores, grading every member of Congress on how they voted, how they co-sponsored, had they been to Darfur, had they done a town hall meeting in their districts, spoken to the media, just anything to try to capture some type of action that they were willing to do and what they could still do. And when we released this report card, it was amazing how many students across the country, with the 1,000 chapters we were able to build, started calling their members of Congress and saying, if I have to bust my butt to get an A, how come you've got a D- or an F? And literally, members of Congress started calling us saying, please get these people to stop calling me. What else can I do? Or I just co-sponsored this bill. Can you please update my grade from a D- to a B- so at least I can tell my constituents that I've got a passing grade. It was unbelievable how this artificial report card that we created dozens of members of Congress and senators to go from failing to passing grades because people were watching them and holding them accountable. A group of students in California in the UC system in Stanford looked at the role of divestment. Divestment, as you know, is a common tool that a lot of students use, famous in the apartheid, against the apartheid regime in South Africa. A lot of people are doing it vis-a-vis Israel, but it's a common tool that a lot of students do because students tend to not have a lot of money, but when you go to college, endowments tend to have a lot of money, and so you can use that pressure against companies. And so by looking at the lessons of past campaigns, we decided divestment was not the best model. We thought that getting companies to change their behavior using shareholder resolutions and other forms of pressure would get them to be helpful instead of being complicit or complacent. And so At the UC level, all these students got the Board of Regents to ensure that human rights criteria, in addition to tobacco or slave labor, is one of the criteria that their investment strategy entails. So they would then have to tell companies, based on the information we have and what we were providing through financial research, you don't meet our criteria, you need to change this behavior, and if not, we're going to have to invest elsewhere. And it was amazing to see companies actually respond to that pressure and improve their behavior. So there was companies that were drilling for oil and mineral extraction was the largest economic behavior in Sudan that provides the revenue for military hardware and guns to commit the atrocities. And so some companies would shift from drilling oil that they couldn't ensure were not providing the military means to commit genocide to drilling for potable water and providing the people. So they didn't leave, they just shifted their operations or shifted their expertise. In some cases, some of the companies did move out, but didn't sell their oil blocks because they knew that another company coming in wouldn't have necessarily provided that same bar of ensuring that they weren't complicit or complacent. And so students in the university system of California and Stanford then introduced legislation at the state level, and with George Clooney and Don Cheadle successfully got then Governor Schwarzenegger to ensure that CalSTRS and CalPERS were also including human rights criteria in their investment strategy. And so students across the country helped pass this in 25 other states. And 60 colleges and universities now have human rights criteria with their endowments, strategic decisions. So over $1 trillion now, but for this effort that students led, now include human rights criteria in their investment strategy. So we saw a significant change in corporate behavior, more than a dozen companies changed their behavior, which is faster in scale than what the apartheid divestment campaign was looking at. The other tool that we did was a tool that everyone has on them at every moment, and that's their phone. And we created this tool, 1-800-GENOCIDE. So anyone who calls 1-800-GENOCIDE could enter their 5-digit zip code, and our system will connect you automatically to your House member, your senators, or let you call the White House. And again, depending on where the bill is, we can turn on and off those functions. So if your House member's already voted, then we don't let you call your House member, we'll patch you straight through to your senator, or if the bill's now into the White House for votes, it'll connect you to the White House. So this was thinking about how do we make stopping genocide as easy as ordering pizza. That was our less diplomatic way of thinking about how to make it easy, effective, entertaining. And we had Mia Farrow, Zach Braff, Chiwetel Elijah-Ford trying to get actors to record the greeting when anyone would call 1-800-GENOCIDE to draw even more people to getting involved. Celebrity power is incredible gravitational pull in getting people involved. We had congressional hearings with leading experts on gender-based violence, and almost no policymaker, sadly, would come to that hearing. But when we had Angelina Jolie or George Clooney or Don Cheadle, almost every member of Congress would be at their seat. Wow. Sad, but that's a lot of how our society works, and so instead of rejecting it, we certainly embrace it and try to use that to our benefit. The other thing was we were looking at is systemic change, and I think a lot of student activism looks at one-offs, and we were really interested in how do we change the actual systems. And fortunately, with Samantha Power and several other leading experts, they created a Genocide Prevention Task Force in the Holocaust Museum, in laying out a blueprint of how the US government can get better at preventing or responding much faster when we hear about genocide and mass atrocities. So we know that hate speech is a classic early warning sign. When you're dehumanizing a group of people, so in the Holocaust they called Jews vermin, in Rwanda they called Tutsis and moderate Hutus cockroaches, so creating the other is a classic early warning sign. It's not necessarily causal, but it's highly correlational. Distribution of small arms is another early warning sign. So if our intelligence community is being able to pick up some of these warning signs, or if our media and civil societies are picking up these warning signs, we don't want to wait until large-scale violence is happening. So they created this amazing, publicly available blueprint of what the US government could do to better prevent and stop genocide. And when President Obama won the presidency and Samantha Power joined the administration, they created a Genocide Prevention Task Force called the Atrocity Prevention Board, created at the National Security Council, that was trying to implement many of these recommendations. And so that included requiring the intelligence community to publicly, annually release where they see hotspots on genocide and mass atrocities around the world. So that way we could make sure that people don't say they didn't know about it, especially internally in the government. And by having people assigned in most of the departments and agencies that are involved with our foreign policy, they would have to get this national intelligence estimate. So that was a cool effort that we saw on the genocide front of systemic change. So obviously the Darfur activism wasn't the only thing that existed at the time or exists today. Many of you may know of Kony 2012. They were close partners who were trying to raise awareness about the crisis that the Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda, and obviously the spread to Congo and Central African Republic and South Sudan, was committing, and most people didn't know who the LRA was, didn't know that Joseph Kony was the head of the LRA. So they've been organizing very successfully over 8 years, showing of multiple films. It was started by a couple of USC film students who had learned about what was happening with the LRA in northern Uganda. And so they would do film screenings at churches and schools all across the country, building up this movement under the branch of Invisible Children. And so during the election, they were hearing from policymakers, we're not hearing from our constituents. If people kept telling us what to do about Kony, then I would be sort of forced to take action. And it's an similar to eerie soundbite that Samantha Power in her book talks about. This former congresswoman from from Denver, Pat Schroeder, when she was asked during the Rwandan genocide, what are you hearing? She says, I'm getting all these phone calls about saving the guerrillas in Rwanda, but I'm not hearing enough phone calls about saving the people in Rwanda. So again, like if people do more than just donate or that's usually it. They usually donate to these types of man-made crises, is to get political. So they made Kony famous. That was their goal. So they produced this 30-minute video, and it broke all viral activism 101 strategy. It was a long video, over 30 minutes, and it reached over 100 million views on YouTube in about a week. And so as a result, again, causal, correlational, even President Obama, his chief of staff was saying, I'm hearing from my kids, I'm hearing from all these people, do something. And they deployed special operation forces to help the African Union to go after Kony and the LRA, and they've seen the largest defection of Lord's Resistance Army's rebels. They still haven't caught Kony, sadly, but the LRA is at its weakest point for an issue that is not a direct threat to our national security. Doesn't affect that many people's lives relative to other crises. They were able to take a lower tier issue and make it a top tier issue for the US government to respond to. There's Carry the Weights, student in Columbia, talking about sexual assault, which I know has been a big issue also at Stanford and many other universities, raising awareness about what's happening and what more colleges and universities can do. Has been another successful movement. There's obviously Dreamers, and students are obviously a natural constituency that are raising awareness and still an ongoing issue. I mentioned BDS with the Israel divestment movement, Black Lives Matter, and then obviously divestment and getting endowments to make sure that they are not funding carbon fuels and looking at renewables. So there's lots of different student movements that have existed in the last couple of years. Some of them are using the same techniques and strategies that we used on Darfur. Some of them are creating new ones. We think some of them are still missing some of the lessons learned that we studied, that other folks have studied. But it's cool to see that the technology and social media is able to bring a lot more young people engaged than they would have otherwise. They wouldn't have heard about it, or they wouldn't necessarily connect with other people who care about these issues. So one of my favorite books is about the abolition of the British slave trade, during the British Empire, or slavery during the British Empire. And it's a cool story written by Adam Hochschild. He's written King Leopold's Ghost, which many more people have heard of because it won more awards. But his other book, Bury the Chains, talks about this college student, Thomas Clarkson, and he was in debate class, and he had to debate why slavery was bad. He was really good at this, and so he won the debates, and he was riding his horse back from, was it Oxford or Cambridge?
I think it was Cambridge.
Okay, from Cambridge, and according to Adam Hochschild, he stops and he's like, whoa, like beyond just like my debate that I won, slavery is pretty bad, someone should do something about this. So he was able to, back in London, reunite with a bunch of other activists, mostly Quakers, and there was just 12 of them who met above a printing press, and they formed the first, according to Adam, modern human rights campaign. And 12 people over 2 decades were able to lobby the British Parliament. William Wilberforce was the famous policymaker. They had former freed slaves testify in town hall meetings. They did petitions. They boycotted sugar because they couldn't guarantee that sugar wasn't made by free people. And they were finally, over 2 decades, able to successfully pass and abolish, under the British Empire, slave trade. And they were able to then also educate a lot of the American abolitionists who were involved in that. And so this was done over 2 decades using candlelight and horseback riding. And so I think that oftentimes with young people is we oftentimes get an immediate feedback loop when we post a tweet and people like it or retweet it within seconds, or Instagram, is that sometimes we need to have perspective that if social change was easy, most people would have already solved it. A lot of these issues take a bit more time. And thinking about how folks did it in the past with a lot of the same techniques and tactics, we are pretty lucky to be able to do all of these things much easier, faster, and cheaper. And so I really like the story of Thomas Clarkson because I think it sort of adds perspective to modern day things. So I usually love doing threes. If you've seen, lots of times I've done stuff in threes. So part of why I get excited about coming to Stanford is how innovative it is. And so all of you know folks who know other folks who are interested in getting involved. So the 3 things I'm eager to get more student engagement in others is Action Map, and this is trying to create a Kayak or Expedia or Orbitz approach to civic engagement. I find it, when I think of easy, effective, entertaining, how ridiculous it is today for concerned citizens to get involved. If you care about climate change, reproductive rights, gun control, you literally have to open up 3 different websites. If you want to support a candidate who's good on that issue to support them, you have to open up another website. If you want to figure out who your policymaker is to then call them and then know what to say, you have to open up possibly another website. And so this I find ridiculous, and it reminds me of the days of having to book airplane tickets where you'd have to open Delta, American, United, and finally Kayak, Orbitz, Expedia. You only have to enter that information once and the airline information comes to you. We should be able to do that for civic engagement. You should be able to open your phone, the GPS knows where you are, assumes where you're registered to vote, similar to Lyft or Uber or Yelp or Airbnb, and then we should immediately be able to know who your policymaker is at every level. Usually that information is public information, what issues they're voting on, debating, doing a town hall, and then we should be able to, based on what issues you care about, feed you the call to action. So you can call them, you can show up at their town hall meetings or their offices, you should be able to tweet or Facebook post or donate, whatever the various actions citizens can take. We should make it as easy as ordering a car or ordering food to be able for you to engage your policymaker. So I need help. I'm not a technologist, but that's the vision, and I need folks to get involved in that. And the Orange Book is looking at how to increase diversity and inclusion in our government at all levels. We're starting at the federal government. There's a thing called the Plum Book that lists 8,000 political appointed positions. Most of them in this administration, at least 80% of them have gone to men. And so if government is supposed to be of the people, by the people, for the people, there's room that we need to improve. And it's not just on this administration or this party. Hillary Clinton, according to my analysis, hired twice the number of men than women when she was Secretary of State. So the idea is for both sides, create, in a better phrased way that Mitt Romney used when he was asked about diversity, he was going to have binders full of women. We would like to have a database full of diverse people, so that for every opening, such as we now have at Department of Homeland Security, or now Secretary for Health and Human Services, we should be able to have lists of qualified women, people of color, LGBTQ, to make it really hard to have to hire yet another straight white man. So orange is the color for diversity and inclusion, and we're calling it the Orange Book. And the last thing is, back to the human rights in Darfur, is there's an amazingly active chapter called Stand here at Stanford, and I believe a freshman is the point person, and that's her email. And so she's always eager to get more folks on or near campus to get involved. Obviously it's not just Darfur, it's South Sudan. They're doing a campaign on Yemen, in Syria. So love for you guys to stay involved if you're interested, if you are involved, or get involved in the anti-genocide, anti-mass atrocities space. Thanks.